All right, today we're going to unpack a really provocative argument from the journalist Chris Hedges. He recently gave this speech where he laid out a pretty chilling vision of where we are on the global stage, a vision he calls the New World Order. So let's break down his perspective piece by piece and try to understand exactly what he's getting at.
And he kicks things off with this, so really stark declaration. For Hedges, what's happening in Gaza isn't some isolated event, not at all. He's arguing it's actually the start of a new, really brutal era. And that idea right there, it sets the stage for everything else he's about to say.
Okay, so let's dive into the first part of his argument, which he calls the immediate crisis. This is where he starts to paint a picture of a world where, in his view, the old rules, well, they just don't apply anymore.
And this is where he introduces the core concept of his entire talk, technologically advanced barbarism. So what does that mean? Well, he defines it as an age where it's basically might makes right. Where powerful countries can just use their incredible military tech to crush any opposition. And things like international law, they become pretty much meaningless.
So, according to Hedges, the very institutions that were built after World War II to prevent this exact kind of chaos, they're just failing. He looks at the UN and sees it as, totally neutered, totally powerless. And international law, he believes it's basically vanished. He even calls it a useless appendage of another age.
And to really illustrate the human cost, Hedges points to this just staggering number. He claims that across these recent conflicts in Lebanon, Gaza, and Iran, a total of 6 million people have been displaced. I mean, think about that. 6 million people in a really short amount of time. It's a number that's so big it's almost hard to wrap your head around. And that's exactly his point, to show the sheer scale of the crisis.
Hedges then goes on to argue that what he's seeing is an emerging pattern. He points to a BBC report to make his case, arguing that the tactics used in Gaza, they're not unique. He claims they're actually being copied, replicated in South Lebanon, creating what he calls a blueprint for destruction.
And that idea of a blueprint leads us right into the next part of his argument, the geopolitical motives behind all of this. So Hedges is now shifting gears from what is happening to why he believes it's happening. And to understand the why, Hedges gives some historical context. He claims that a U.S. war with Iran isn't some new idea that just popped up. He says it's been a long-term goal for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a consistent push, he asserts, for 4 decades, something that previous U.S. administrations had apparently resisted.
Okay, so what would be the goal of a potential war with Iran? Well, Hedges argues that the public reasons you hear from the U.S., things like stopping a nuclear program or fighting terrorism, he sees that as a smokescreen. He claims that Israel's real objective is the physical disintegration of Iran. The idea would be to shatter the country into smaller pieces along ethnic and religious lines, effectively neutralizing it as a regional power.
And right here, Hedges lays out what he believes is the ultimate endgame. If Iran were to be shattered, it would leave Israel as the undisputed dominant power in the region. This, he says, would fulfill what he calls the long-held ambition for a greater Israel, which is a term that refers to the idea of expanding Israel's borders. And, he adds, it would also conveniently open up Iran's massive oil and gas reserves to foreign control.
Okay, so now Hedges zooms out even further. He wants to explore what he sees as the ideological and moral justification for all these actions. And it's fair to say, this is probably the most controversial part of his entire argument.
So his core thesis here is that the memory of the Holocaust has been, in his words, hijacked. He argues that it's being used not to prevent future atrocities against anyone, but to specifically sanctify Jews as eternal victims. And he claims this, in turn, serves to absolve the state of Israel of its own actions, which he describes as settler colonialism, apartheid, and genocide.
Now, to make this point more concrete, Hedges brings up a specific anecdote. He talks about an Instagram post from the Holocaust Museum in Los Angeles that apparently read, "Never again can't only mean never again for Jews." He claims that post was deleted after it got some criticism. For Hedges, this one little incident is proof. It's proof that the universal message of never again is being narrowed down to mean, as he puts it, never again only for Jews. And to support this line of argument, he brings in a really powerful voice from within the survivor community itself, Primo Levi. Hedges points out that Levi, an Auschwitz survivor, was actually a fierce critic of Israel's treatment of Palestinians. He warned against this dangerous, simple way of thinking, of just dividing the world into a simple us and them, into victims and perpetrators.
And all of this leads Hedges to ask some really challenging questions. What is the role of a Holocaust museum, especially in a country so far away from where it happened? Is it to teach a universal lesson, a reminder that it can happen here to anyone? Or, he asks, has it become a tool to rally one's own people, to demand special consideration and to justify certain political actions?
So from that point, Hedges zooms his lens out even wider. He makes the argument that genocide isn't some rare exception in Western civilization. Instead, he claims, it's a core, repeating feature, part of its DNA, really.
And he uses this incredible quote from the writer Aimé Césaire to make a pretty startling connection. The argument here is that what Hitler did, it wasn't some brand new horror. Césaire's point, which Hedges adopts, is that Hitler just applied the brutal methods of colonialism, which had been used for centuries against Arabs, Indians, and Africans, and turned them on fellow Europeans for the first time.
Now, this lays out a very direct and, a deeply controversial historical line that Hedges draws. He claims that when the Nazis were writing their infamous Nuremberg laws, the ones that stripped Jewish people of their citizenship, they actually studied and used America's own laws as a model. Specifically, the laws that disenfranchised black citizens and made interracial marriage a crime.
So he then pushes back on the idea of a single, unique Holocaust by pointing to what he calls other, unacknowledged Holocausts throughout history. He lists the near annihilation of Tasmania's Aboriginals, the German slaughter of the Herero and Namaqua peoples, the Armenian genocide, the list goes on. His point is that this pattern of dehumanization and extermination has happened over and over again, especially within Western colonial projects.
All right, so after laying out all that history, Hedges brings his argument right back to the present day. He connects the dots, drawing a direct line from what he calls savagely abroad to what he sees as very real, rising threats right at home.
And he does this by quoting the writer James Baldwin, who warned decades ago about a terrible probability. Baldwin said that if Western nations couldn't face their own history, their own crimes, they would end up causing chaos all over the world, a racial war like nothing we've ever seen. And for Hedges, that prediction, it's coming true right now.
So who does Hedges think is driving all of this? Well, he offers a pretty damning psychological profile of what he calls the global elite. He claims they have the core traits of psychopaths, superficial charm, a huge sense of self-importance, a habit of lying and manipulating, and just a complete inability to feel guilt or remorse. Basically, a total lack of empathy, which in his view makes them completely incapable of any real moral leadership.
He wraps the section up by returning to that haunting voice of Primo Levi. The quote basically suggests that the enemy isn't just out there, it's also inside. That, in a way, we're all living in a kind of ghetto, walled in, with the lords of death waiting right outside. It's this powerful metaphor for our collective vulnerability.
And all of this brings us to Hedges' final and really stark conclusion. He argues that the systems we live in are so broken that they can't be reformed from the inside. And if that's true, he says, we're left with only two choices. We can obstruct or surrender. He doesn't offer any easy answers here. He just leaves us with that profound question to think about. In the world he just described, what does that choice really mean for us today?